Welcome to the 5th episode of our series on home food preservation. The aim of this series has been to encourage everyone to grow more food, to buy locally, and to preserve that food, both to improve their diet and to increase the sustainability of our food system. And this evening, or actually it's day now, but in this episode, we are going to be covering canning tomatoes, because tomatoes are what used to be called a cash crop. They're incredibly versatile. You can make a million things out of them, like salsas, sauces, you can make pickles, and they also are like the base ingredients of a whole lot of different recipes. So when there is a heavy harvest coming on, I look forward to canning them in some of their basic forms: whole, chopped, sauced, or even pureed. Now it's mid-June here, and some of you may think, if you're in the Puget Sound area, that it's too late to plant any tomatoes. But if you have some space, David Thompson of the Food is Free Tacoma group is also a master gardener, and he's provided us with a list of some tomatoes and some suggested timings on them. And so it's still time for you to get those out there, but there will also be plenty available from local growers later in the year. Now, like always, we're going to be covering a lot of information, some of it like the history of tomatoes and some other things about tomatoes, just briefly. But if you're interested in going deeper, as always, there will be a resource list. Links will be on the comments on this video and also on Facebook page posts. So let's start off by talking about tomatoes, which are a fruit. Now, I know that surprises a lot of people, but by definition, a fruit is any plant that grows its seeds and contains them within a flower. And there's lots more information. You could go very deep on that in our resource list. But the quote that I always like is, "Knowledge is knowing that the tomato is a fruit. Philosophy is wondering if ketchup is a smoothie." The tomato was native to South America and Central America. And when it was first discovered, there were probably much smaller varieties than what we have now, and they were probably orange and yellow. Cortez first brought the seeds to Europe in the early 1500s, and they were not popular at first. Unfortunately, the fruit resembled something which was called the wolf peach, which was very poisonous. And it also was left to the lower classes to eat, as the nobles chose not to eat it after the first couple of times. You see, the nobles at that point were using plates and utensils that contained a lot of lead. And so the acid in the tomatoes was leaching that lead out, and they realized they were slowly being poisoned by the tomatoes. Although it was actually the lead, they blamed the tomatoes. Now, the lower classes, they usually ate off of either wooden or sometimes clay plates. And usually all of their utensils were wooden. And so they were able to thrive on the vitamin C and other minerals and vitamins that were within the tomatoes. So they didn't entirely disappear. And they're the ones who started to develop the things that first made the tomatoes popular, like a very early version of pizza and also tomato sauce and pasta sauces. Now, tomatoes are what are called a high acid fruit. Any fruit or vegetable where the pH is lower than 4.6 is considered to be high acid. And that's what makes it fairly easy and safe to can tomatoes. because as we've mentioned in other sessions, the acidity helps slow down bacteria reproduction or even kills it. So the first thing we're going to do is peel our tomatoes. And you may ask why we peel a lot of fruits and vegetables before we use them. Well, one reason, especially like with root crops like carrots or potatoes, is they have a very heavy bacterial load on the surface. And so sometimes those bacteria will resist even the canning process. But with tomatoes, we want to get the skin off because the skin has a much different texture than the meat of the tomato. And so if you make a sauce or a puree with it, that texture is going to still remain in bits and pieces. And also the skin contains flavonoids that can add a bitter taste. So the simplest way to skin the tomatoes is to just make a little X cut and then place them in boiling water for about 30 seconds or so. You leave them in there until the skins start to peel back. And so the tomatoes are ready to be peeled when you see the skin already pulling back. Now, in older recipes, they suggested that you want to plunge them into ice water, which you can do. But this is just water from a regular refrigerator, and the USDA said that that's fine. That's working very well. And so you can see that the skins just easily peel off. And we're using Roma tomatoes because these are going to be destined eventually for some of my homemade ketchup. So you want to use paste tomatoes for those if possible. Now the skins you can take and boil to make sure you kill any bacteria on the surface, and then make a paste of that and dehydrate it and make a tomato powder, which you can add to a lot of different ingredients. Now, the only other thing that we're going to do is we're going to cut the core out and then half them. A little bit messy here. And we'll pull some of those seeds out before we process them. All right, so as you can see, we have been bringing the tomatoes up to a boiling point after we had cored them and taken the seeds out. And this is what's going to be called a hot pack. Now there's basically two different ways of canning, especially tomatoes. There is a cold pack where we would have just put the sliced, pureed, or chopped tomatoes into the containers and then water bath can them. And then there's a hot pack. And that's the method we're using, where we have boiled the tomatoes. Now, there are pros and cons to both. Of course, the cold pack is a little bit faster, and you could technically argue it uses a little less energy. But they've also felt that it possibly is not quite as safe in terms of killing bacteria as a hot pack would be. And also, it helps to reduce what in berries or tomatoes is called fruit float. And that's where air that has been trapped in the fruit gets loose, and it causes the fruit to separate from the liquid. So you have floating fruit on top, and then you have the liquid below. But with the hot pack, we've warmed the jars, and then in each jar, for these pints, you add 1 tablespoon of lemon juice. Now you're saying, but the tomatoes are already acidic. But the degree of acidity varies between types of tomatoes, where they were harvested, the nutrients that are in the soil. So we add the extra. You can also, if you choose, add up to a ½ teaspoon of salt per pint. I tend usually to leave the salt out because I'm figuring that it's going to be contained in whatever recipe we're using. All right, so we have the jars all warmed, and we're just doing a small demonstration batch here. So we take the tomatoes and the liquid that they were cooked in, and we're looking for ½ inch headroom. And so that is approximately this amount. And we have some lids in here that have also been warmed. So we're wiping the edge, the rim of the jar. And then we put on the lid, screw it down, and place it in the hot water bath. And close it up and bring it back to a full boil. So while this is coming up to a rolling boil, because you remember that we always start the canning time from when it's fully boiling, which it's almost there, I'd like to talk a little bit about the safety of this product. So because the product is a high acid product, we want to be sure that you take, after it's totally sealed, this is what it's going to look like when it's fully done. When it's totally sealed, you're going to want to take the rings off and make sure you wash the jar thoroughly. And usually we suggest that you store the jars with the rings off, because if they're a little bit leakage or anything like that, even if you wash them, it may rust the rings. But then also, you might not be able to tell that the seal is bad because they won't start bulging up. And so that's just a good safety thing. When you store them, and we have lots of information in the resource list, usually you can store them in 2 layers, but you need to put some good solid cardboard between the layers. You want to label them well with the date and the product and any special notes that you might have, briefly of course, and keep them at a temperature that is below 70 degrees if possible, and out of sunlight, and especially if you're living in some place that is prone to earthquakes, make sure that you have something across the front of your shelves or cabinets that might hold them in if it's just a smaller quake. Well, it's now been the 40-minute cook time plus 5-minute stand, and we're going to take out the 1 jar that we did, and you can compare it to the other jar. And you can see they're pretty much the same, which they should be. And once a reminder, you want to leave them in an environment where they can cool, not contacting metal, but something non-heat conductive, like this cutting board or a towel. And if you want, you can put a towel over the top, but don't push on them. And so this is giving you an idea about making things that are going to be the base ingredient for a lot of other products. So I hope that this episode will be useful to you to encourage you to think of the produce that you buy or grow as being an ingredient that you can use in future products, as well as the recipes you're producing at the moment. So please come back next time for the 6th episode, where we'll be talking about fermentation and making some sauerkraut.